Do you guys want to do one more RFK thing? He released a video called Here's the Truth About Ukraine, and it got 109,000 likes, 6.8 million views. When it says 6.8 million views, let me be clear. This doesn't necessarily mean somebody watched it. It just means that somebody's seen the tweet. I always thought this view counter was a little deceptive because it makes you think that 6.8 million people actually sat down and watched it, when all that means is you kind of just did the equivalent of this. But putting that aside, it seems that at least 109,000 people watched this and thought, man, RFK understands the truth about the war in Ukraine. And that would be quite surprising to me because I've seen the guy lie about Ukraine quite constantly. Like we said in the earlier segment, he said on the Joe Rogan podcast that the war in Ukraine has cost us like $3 trillion plus. Nothing even close to that has been spent. They'd have mechs if that was the case. He said that for every Russian that dies, 7 Ukrainians in the military dies, completely made up from a photoshopped version of the Jack Textera leaks that he got tricked by. And it isn't just Ukraine that he gets, he lies about. There's other topics too. But in the war in Ukraine, on this topic, he has been particularly bad when it comes to spreading misinformation. So, seeing one of his posts go viral like this, thought I might as well take a moment to check it out to see what all the hubbub is about.
This is a war that should have never happened. It's a war that Russians tried repeatedly to settle on terms that were very, very beneficial to Ukraine and us. The major thing they wanted was for us to keep NATO out of the Ukraine.
Wow. Okay, so they tried to end it on multiple occasions on terms that were very, very favorable to us. What terms were those? Was it back in 2014, before Euromaidan, when the Russians used economic coercion, which they promised not to, the Budapest Memorandum, to force their own government, their government that they backed, Yanukovych's government, to try to back out of the association agreement with the EU, so the Ukrainians could try to find a way out of the economic stagnation that they had been set in since the collapse of the Soviet Union due to large-scale corruption and somewhat a lack of access to the European market? Hell, that would also give opportunities for Ukrainians to go into Europe on work visas and work and possibly send money home. But maybe that's not what he's talking about. Maybe he's talking about after the Euromaidan, when the Russians said they weren't going to invade Crimea and they took Crimea. Was that when it was the favorable deal and when they were offering accept our illegal annexation? Or was it when they were moving thousands of troops and munitions into the Donbass over the next, 4 to 5 years? The whole timeline about it as well, only to be discovered by OSCENT researchers finding Russian soldiers just removing the patches off their uniform, moving in tanks that only the Russian army has, and we find them spotted in occupied, rebel-held territory in Ukraine up until 2022. Was it any period within them? Was it Minsk 1 or Minsk 2, which was forced upon the Ukrainians and still meant that people who fled Crimea could not return due to the political status of the occupied territories, or 1/3 of both Luhansk and Donetsk being occupied? And hell, when they agreed to pull their troops out, which they denied that they even had in the country, they didn't. They continued to operate in the country. And then when Petro Poroshenko tried to confront them about it, he would just play dumb and say, what troops, what soldiers? Yes, I'm sure all these rebels, many of them made up of former gang members, just got these anti-tank weapons and anti-air weapons and modern tanks and armored personnel carriers and artillery guns and an endless stream of ammunition. I'm sure it all just appeared out of nowhere. He says they offered them a good deal. He doesn't elaborate on the deal because if he was to give you all the details of any of the deals that were offered, even the ones that were broke later, most Ukrainians would not consider them satisfactory. And satisfactory to whose terms? His terms from how he views the Ukrainians, or to the Ukrainians' terms? Because that has yet to be achieved. Oh, as for the NATO thing, which he says that the major thing they wanted was us to keep NATO out of Ukraine. I don't know how you see that recent Putin speech and just say, oh, this is the major thing they wanted. Why is this the major thing they want? Why is this the priority that they wanted? And if it is the priority that they wanted, they had achieved it long ago. I mean, honestly, even in 2008, when Ukraine was offered by some EU officials, some NATO officials, oh, eventually one day you're going to join, there were still states then in Ukraine, not in Ukraine, in Europe who were against Ukraine joining. The Hungarians, the French, the Germans, Turks. You would have to get all of these countries to agree. You'd have to convince Viktor Orban before the Russian invasion that Ukraine should join. You would have to convince all these different European powers, many of them heavily reliant on Russian imports, the Germans especially, who thought that economic collaboration would liberalize the Russians. You have to convince them to let the Ukrainians in. It was, at least at that point, a lost cause. And it was a lost cause up until 2014. And it was especially a lost cause after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, since now they also had a territorial dispute, which NATO introduced legislation to make it so nation states that have territorial disputes cannot join NATO, specifically for situations like this, so they can't get pulled into a war. So Russia had already achieved keeping Ukraine out of NATO by the 2022 invasion. They invaded in 2014, and Ukraine hadn't joined NATO in the 8 years since. So to say that's the major thing they wanted, when there was no progress being made in that arena in the last 8 years, how can that be the case? I mean, if you watch that Tucker interview and you see the first 44 minutes of rambling and ranting about Russian history, you could look at that and say, wow, that rambling rant about how Russia is eternal, Russia's borders end nowhere, and how they have a right to this territory because of their interconnectedness to the people there who are really Russian. Maybe he wants to build an empire. Maybe he's a Russian chauvinist. Maybe he believes that Russia has a right to that land, as he says again and again and again. Not just him, but Medvedev, but other Russian government officials, members of the Russian Orthodox Church, and members of the Duma. Just saying, a little bit of a reductionist, isn't he? Continuing.
The big military contractors want to add new countries to NATO all the time. Why? Because then that country has to conform its military purchases to NATO weapon specifications, which means certain companies, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, General Dynamics, Boeing, and Lockheed, get a trapped market.
The reason we have NATO standardization is because if there's a war between NATO and any force, it's going to be much easier for these different nation states to work together and have their armies integrated under NATO command if they use the same ammunition. It simplifies logistics. And if we've learned anything from World War II, is that, what was it? It was amateurs study battlefield tactics, professionals study logistics. I forget the old quote, but logistics is unbelievably important. In fact, one of the issues of Ukrainian logistics is that they've had to rely on so many different weapon systems and systems that rely on a different piece of ammunition as they try to find ad hoc solutions from all these different donor states, which have still, within NATO itself, failed to completely integrate themselves within NATO's specifications. That has complicated their aid. It has complicated their logistics. One example of this would actually be, I believe it was the Abrams. There was talk of, if we have all these different tank models and then we have to get all these different tank parts, and the Abrams is particularly logistics heavy, maybe it doesn't make sense. You get the idea. There's a real tactical, strategic, logistical reason to have them all using NATO standard ammunition. NATO has been working towards this for a very long time. And when you talking about NATO standard weapons or NATO equipment, all these different companies would compete to try to get these contracts. So, I mean, that's how it works everywhere. That's how it works in China, too. The only difference is China is now part of a multi-state alliance spanning over 20 countries that has to rely on these different allies for their defense, and therefore has to coordinate their ammunition and logistics with them. So it just sounds like he doesn't understand NATO logistics. Like, I'm sure that the companies that get the contracts to make the money, they're happy. I'm sure that they have some lobbying potential. I'm sure that to them, there's a perverse incentive, including in their lobbying and who they give money to, which politicians. But that's a far cry from, the reason we have 155 millimeter ammunition, artillery shells, is the standard for NATO is because Lockheed Martin needed to make a penny. That's not only reductionist, it's just honestly a lie.
March of 2022, we committed $113 billion.
Hey, he reformed his numbers. Before it was $3 trillion. Wow, where'd all that money go?
Just to give you an example, we could have built a home for almost every homeless person in this country.
That's not, dude, every single thing he says in this video is a lie. No, we couldn't have. There's a few reasons we couldn't have, but the first thing is much of the military equipment we sent, especially the older equipment, which we were counting as their original manufacturing price, not their current price. So let's say you have a troop carrier worth $10 million, $15 million. Of course, I can't think of the exact price of the old Vietnam troop carriers that we gave them. If they were made at like 5 million, 3 million, 2 million, whatever it was, like 20 years ago, maybe, or 30, 40 years ago, but today they're worth maybe $300,000. It counts it as the manufacturing price. But putting that aside, because they have been fudging the numbers a little bit on that, and I think there was an adjustment to that in order to get more aid to Ukraine. The other issue is a lot of this gear is old hand-me-down equipment. We were never going to take those old Vietnam troop carriers that we were giving them, stuff that's 50, 60 years old. If we put our soldiers in that equipment and send them off to battle, it would be a scandal. Here's another thing. Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, all these companies, they don't profit from us giving Ukraine these old-style troop carriers. Almost like there's another incentive here outside of profit, and this is a very reductionist model for people who read that. What was that book? War is a Scam? I think it's War is a Scam, or War is it's an old book that was released during World War I. People read it, and then they think they've gotten foreign policy and the defense industry down to a T. But all they've done is looked at, what is it? War is a racket. Yeah, that's it. It's reductionist. Anyway, continuing.
We then commit.
But like, we can't take those old Vietnam troop carriers and turn them into houses. We can't just give those to the homeless. It's not how that works.
Another $24 billion since then, 2 months ago, and now President Biden's asking for another $60 billion.
We did not commit another $24 billion a few months ago. We tried to commit another $24 billion, and it was shot down by Kevin McCarthy as part of a continuing resolution or as part of the budget. And then they were like, okay, well, if this gets shut down, then can we pass the $60 billion for the next year? And then it kept getting kicked down the road for about over 100 days now. These negotiations started in September of last year. I think it's been 110 or 115 days since then. So no, the $24 billion, we didn't give them. It was denied. Now we're trying to give them $60 billion.
But the big expenses are going to come after the war, when we have to rebuild all the things that we destroyed.
Well, yes, this is true. Wait. Reel it back. Wait, what did he say?
War. When big expenses are going to come after the war, when we have to rebuild all the things that we destroyed.
That we destroyed? You know, when you look at all the blame that's being placed here, none of it has yet to be placed on the Russians. I just want to throw that out there. All the blame has been placed on us. The Russians come to Ukraine, bomb everything, say the Ukrainians aren't real, they're artificial, they're basically Russians light, they're like diet Russians, and then it's our fault. Even though we kept them out of NATO, and when the Ukrainians came to us to try to fulfill the Budapest Memorandum, the commitments we made to them, for them to give up the ultimate guarantor of state sovereignty, their nuclear arsenal, we said, we'll sanction the Russians a bit, but you can't expect much more than that. We'll give you a little training here. How about this? We'll give you a radar system so you can see where the Russians are blowing you up from. So you can see the shells as they come at you. Nothing to shoot them back at them. No. That wouldn't come until what? 2019, and even those were javelins. Point is, I really don't like his framing here.
Mitch McConnell was asked, can we really afford to spend $113 billion to Ukraine? He said, don't worry. It's not really going to Ukraine.
It's going to American defense manufacturers.
So he just...
That's true. A lot of the money is going to American defense manufacturers. Because guess what? Weapons have to be made. I mean, look, you can have a problem with the profit incentive in the defense industry, but ever since war has existed, ever since there was man beating other man with sharpened rock for kissing his cave girlfriend, there has been other man from separate tribe selling rock, sharpened rock, to murderer man killing the adulteress. Ever since there was violence, ever since there was some form of war or conflict, there was someone on the sideline trying to make a profit from it. If you go back to the earliest versions of human history, or the earliest recorded records of human history, you'll find people profiting off of war. That's bad, but it's been a constant. And so acting like, oh my God, defense companies make money when we have to buy weapons for them for war. Yes. Yes. You could say it's a perverse incentive. But if we're going to send weapons to Ukraine, we have to buy them and manufacture them somewhere. I think there's an argument to be made about replenishing American stockpiles and counting that as aid to Ukraine. I think there's a question there, but that's not what he's talking about. He's saying that any money spent with these defense companies to help Ukraine is what? Is evil? Is not, it's all to just profit them? Where else could we have gotten the weapons from? That'd be my question. If we had to buy weapons for a purpose, whether it's defending ourselves or other people, where do we get weapons from? If not defense manufacturers. Mind you, the Chinese get their weapons from defense manufacturers too. So do the Russians, so do the French, so do the Germans, so do everyone. This is a perverse incentive. Now, the exact nature of the perverse incentive in each country is different depending on the domestic and geopolitical situation. But that incentive exists to at least some extent in every country, at least every major country.
Manufacturers.
So he just admitted it's a money laundering scheme.
I'm sorry. What does this count? Like count 1,892 of people not knowing what money laundering is? That's not what money laundering isn't buying weapons from defense contractors and then giving those weapons to our allies as the money was congressionally approved. That's not what money laundering is. Not like, can they just Google what money laundering is? Money laundering isn't when you spend money on things you don't like. Money laundering isn't when you give money to companies that you don't like. Money laundering isn't when you send money to a foreign country. And money laundering isn't when you spend money on products to then send to a foreign country. None of these things are money laundering. There's no interpretation of this where it's money laundering. 106,000 likes.
And who do you think owns every one of those companies?
Oh my God, is he gonna make another BlackRock? Oh my God. I'm sorry, man. There's some people that every issue needs to connect and merge into the issue that they know about. I see there's people that have to drag every issue into their dialogue tree, and this is an example of it. The war in Ukraine has almost nothing to do, and I would argue has nothing to do with BlackRock whatsoever. To mention BlackRock in this is silly. Can we stick to how about we talk about Euromaidan? Or how about we talk about the collapse of the Soviet Union and the stagnation and corruption that festered since then, and how that motivated people to come out on the street during Euromaidan and has motivated anti-corruption activists. Let's talk about real Ukrainian corruption cases. Why don't I ever hear RFK or the rest of these schmucks talk about the hostile military administration? That's a real corruption case. What about the spying on Ukrainian journalists by somebody who might be close to the presidential office? That's a real case of possible attacks on press freedom that's happening in Ukraine. It's getting a lot of attention in Ukrainian domestic politics. But instead, we get Gonzalo Lira, the unvaccinated sperm king, and we get BlackRock. Why can't we get real issues that are affecting everyday Ukrainians, real issues of corruption that are publicly reported, that we could grab at any point if you just were to look at local Ukrainian sources? But instead of talking about the realistic cases of corruption, which is not going to be, oh my God, like Vivek Kwame said, we sent weapons to Ukraine and then went to the cartels. It's going to be, there was a guy in a position of power who knew another guy, who was his friend, who had a shell company with no experience in defense or no experience in this or no experience in, for example, making jackets for the military, then made a bunch of up-priced jackets that were basically stealing from the budget through this shell company by giving them a low-quality product for high prices. That is an example of corruption that is semi-common in Ukraine, and we've seen cases of that recently and people being put on trial for it. Now, those stories exist, but instead of covering that, which is much more boring and I guess not entertaining, and it actually would require some maybe knowledge of the country, Just fit it into your conspiracy theory dialogue tree.
Yeah, BlackRock. So Tim Scott, during the Republican debate, said, don't worry, it's not a gift to Ukraine.
I love that Tim Scott is completely 180'd, man. He's completely 180'd. Tim Scott and everybody else is 180 as Trump 180'd. He's the leader of the party, so he's king.
It's a loan. So raise your hand if you think that loan's ever getting paid back. Yeah, of course it's not. So why do they call it a loan?
Well, for some of it, it is. I think I think there is some of it that literally is a loan. Not all of it's a loan. But yeah, I wouldn't call all of it a loan. I would call it a commitment to European security, which is that within America's interest, a commitment to nuclear non-proliferation, to uphold the commitment we made in the 90s. I could call it many things, the defense of democracy, if you want to get grandiose, but I wouldn't call it a loan.
Because if they call it a loan, they can impose loan conditions. And what are the loan conditions that we impose on? Number one, an extreme austerity program, so that if you're poor in Ukraine, you're going to be poor forever.
What?
Number two.
Dude, can we look at like Ukrainian versus Polish GDP growth? I want to show you guys how bad it's been. Can we get is there any graphs in here? Oh, I want GDP growth. Oh, yeah, there it is. Do you think this might make a country say, man, I might want to be part of the European system? Maybe being part of the Russian economic union, maybe being in the Russian sphere of influence here, being awash with oligarchical corruption isn't working. Maybe this isn't working and we need to try a new model and integrate with the EU through maybe an association agreement or maybe membership. Maybe we need to change things up, try a different model of government, and not engage in the same corruption that Putin's been fostering for decades in not only Ukraine, but in Moldova and in other countries as well, Belarus and its own country. If you're Ukraine here, you've been stagnant since the collapse of the Soviet Union, economically speaking. And this has not only contributed to an economic disaster, but a demographic disaster. They need to change their economic and political and geopolitical fortunes. And that's going to require them to shift their model. Now, I don't like a lot of Zelensky's economic proposals, but I'll tell you this. If Ukraine joins the European Union, its access to the European markets through its grain sales and the pure black soil. When I say pure black soil, I mean the soil in Ukraine is fertile. It's extra competitive, and it will beat out many of its competitors. It's called for the breadbasket of Europe for a reason. That could genuinely help the Ukrainian GDP. There's a bunch of things that could generally help the Ukrainian GDP by being integrated in the European economic model. Before the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine was predicted by German economists to be potentially one of the most prosperous post-Soviet states with a bright future ahead of it. But that did not come to be due to domestic political factors. There's a reason why they want to move over to the European model, and I don't blame them. Where were we? Oh yeah, entity.
Most important, Ukraine has to put all of its...
By the way, let me just say, I don't support a lot of Zelensky's positions, definitely a lot of the more libertarian economic policy. But again, when he's saying like, oh, the Ukrainians are going to be poor forever, what new pathway should they choose? Why should they stay stagnant where they are now, with many of them in perpetual poverty? Just saying, continuing.
All of its government-owned assets up for sale to multinational corporations, including all of its agricultural land, the biggest single asset in Europe. In Ukraine, there's been 1,000 years of war fought over that land. It's the richest farmland in the world. It's the breadbasket of Europe. 500,000 kids almost, Ukrainian kids, have died to keep that land as part of Ukraine. They almost certainly didn't know about this loan condition. They've already sold 30% of it. The buyers were DuPont, Cargill, and Monsanto.
Okay, so let's look up Monsanto quick, because now we're talking about Monsanto as to why we're fighting the war in Ukraine. It's not the Ukrainians want to sell their grain in Europe. It's Monsanto wants us to support the Ukrainians so they can make profit. Let's just Google Monsanto quick. 1 second. So if you were trying to measure, Monsanto.com. Why isn't their website working? Oh, that's interesting. Seems like the company was defunct since 2018. Nah, I'm sure they caused the war. I'm sure they caused the war. No, I'm sure. No, I'm sure they caused the war. No, I'm sure they caused the war. Anyway, I think they changed names. They rebranded. 1 second. I think it actually says here the name Monsanto was no longer used, but Monsanto's previous product brands were maintained. Bayer announced its intent to acquire Monsanto. Okay, so Monsanto was bought, and then it was made defunct. So how is it Monsanto's fault? So is it this German? Is it the German? Is it Bayer AG? Is this the company that we should be angry at, not Monsanto? Then I'm sorry. Look, he's just throwing out agricultural companies to say that they're the reason that they're fighting. Now, look, it is true that the Ukrainians are selling off land. This is a true fact. But let's just throw out there quickly that if the Ukrainians don't win the war, they're not going to have the land. There'll be nobody to farm the land. And lastly, the Russians are trying to strangle the Ukrainian land. They're trying to block the grain corridor. You can say you don't like this grain policy, or you don't like this farm policy or the agricultural policy. But these are things that were announced like a year and a half into this war. To say that this was the truth about the war in Ukraine,
did you hear about Polish farmers destroying Ukrainian grain because they're mad about prices being too low due to Ukraine grain being dumped
Zelensky's
on
economic policies, as somebody who has said he was going to bust up the government corruption and put control back in the hands of the people. I mean, he's a neoliberal type. So, I mean, this isn't like our fault. This is like what Zelensky has always been about. Strange Pains, thank you so much for the $5. On the topic, Poland and Ukraine. Did you hear the Polish farmers destroying Ukrainian grain? That's another thing. If this is the case, that Europe just wants access to Ukrainian grain, and that's what this war is about, why are there Polish farmers literally like dumping the grain on the side of the road, and Poland just allowing that to happen, damaging Ukrainian agricultural products as they enter the European market? Anyway, I think that this war is not over Monsanto.
And this war to Ukraine. They almost certainly didn't know about this loan condition. They've already sold 30% of it. The buyers were DuPont, Cargill, and Monsanto. Who do you think owns all of those companies? Yeah, BlackRock. And then
again, it's all BlackRock. Let me just throw this out here. This war has nothing to do with BlackRock. It has nothing to do with BlackRock. It has nothing to do with BlackRock. Everybody just wants to make everything about BlackRock. All the TikToks are about BlackRock. All the YouTube shorts are about BlackRock. This is just a simple way to make it all about capital and finance, and the corporations all did it. And none of this has to do with the history of Ukrainian-Russian relations. It removes any historical knowledge you need to have about the war and allows you to just fit it within your prescribed moral fervor of BlackRock, economic conspiracy. You cannot like these companies, but not every problem in the world is the fault of these companies.
in December, President Biden gave out the contract to rebuild Ukraine. And who do you think got that contract? BlackRock. So they're doing this.
BlackRock was not given the deal to reconstruct Ukraine. There are many, many different companies that are getting deals to reconstruct Ukraine. This is the funny thing, is there are actually corrupt deals on reconstruction, like the Hostile Military Administration. The Kiev Independent did a great story on this. And their corruption was so bad that it caused NGOs that were trying to help rebuild using renewable materials in these communities He'll just like give up on the project and go somewhere else. That's a real scandal. Something that needs to get called out. Real corruption. And instead, BlackRock.
Right in front of us. They don't even care that we know anymore, because they know that they can get away with it. And how do they know that? Because they have a strategy. And that strategy is an old strategy, which is they keep us at war with each other. They keep us hating on each other. They keep the Republicans and Democrats fighting each other.
It's so convenient that this war just seemed to perfectly align with his moral and political platitudes, huh? So it's so cute that it just fit perfectly in his little dialogue tree.
Black against white and all these divisions that they sow.
I don't know how you can release an ad like this within a few days of the Tucker Carlson interview, where Putin goes on a 44-minute rant on how Russia is a turtle and it always had the right to that land. And then you say, wow, I think this is Monsanto's fault. Knuckle dragger.